As we, in the last episode, talked about the broader topic of the Baroque era in general and broad guiding principles, today we will be taking a more detailed look at the adaptation of these principles into architecture of the Baroque. In the process, Werderburg is about to grow massively in size, getting 2 new churches along the way. The Baroque architectural style first emerged around 1568 in Rome. It was not a coincidence, but a deliberate response by the Catholic Church to the challenges of the Reformation. During the so-called Counter-Reformation, church leaders realized that theological arguments alone were no longer enough to keep the loyalty of their believers. Instead, architecture was meant to create an emotional experience. Monumental buildings, impressive spaces, and dramatic lighting were all used to make the divine feel present on earth. To achieve this, the early Baroque deliberately moved away from the strict symmetry and mathematical precision of the Renaissance. Rather than relying on calm and balanced forms, architects introduced movement into the buildings by breaking up straight lines and creating dynamic compositions. The Jesuit church Il Gesù in Rome is regarded as the prototype of all later Baroque churches. Its carefully structured facade, with the architectural elements becoming narrower towards the main entrance, creates a strong visual pull. The floor plan combines the traditional long nave with a large central dome, creating the ideal setting for the emotionally charged sermons of the Jesuit order, while also providing excellent acoustics. Rome was not only the seat of the Pope, but also the cultural center of the Catholic world. The popes invested enormous sums into churches, palaces, and public squares to demonstrate the strength and authority of the Catholic Church. Because of this, Rome became the architectural model for most of later Baroque projects throughout the entirety of Europe. The central idea behind Baroque architecture was the, yet again, concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, meaning a total work of art. At the same time, architecture was used to display both political and religious power. Grand palaces presented rulers as monarchs chosen by God, while monumental churches emphasized the spiritual authority of the Catholic Church. As a result, Baroque architecture was never designed to be purely functional. It always served as a deliberate means of representation. A Baroque building was therefore never intended to stand on its own. Instead, architecture, sculpture, painting, and even formal garden design were combined into one unified composition. The buildings were designed to avoid the static appearance of earlier periods. Through deep facades, strong three-dimensional modeling, and carefully planned optical effects, architects created the impression of continuous movement, drawing the viewer directly into the building itself. The display of wealth was by no means limited to the nobility, though, with their palaces, or the church with its richly decorated churches. The wealthy urban middle class also adopted many of the new architectural ideas, although they adapted them to a smaller urban scale. One of the most characteristic features of these town houses were their emphasized entrance portals, which were designed to openly display the wealth and status of the owner. The facades themselves followed a regular arrangement of windows, which were often highlighted with decorative window pediments, also known as window hoods. Large plastered wall surfaces, combined with decorative stucco work, further shaped the appearance of many Baroque towns. A good example of this type of middle-class Baroque architecture is the Kügelgenhaus in Dresden. Its balanced facade and carefully designed window frames show how elegance and growing middle-class confidence came together during this period. At the same time, this architecture reflected the increasing prosperity of merchants and government officials. Through representative facades, they sought to demonstrate their social position, while taking inspiration from the residences of the ruling dynasties. When designing churches, Baroque architects moved away from the simple and harmonious central plans of the Renaissance, which were mainly based on circular layouts. Instead, they preferred oval floor plans, or a combination of a long nave with a large central dome. The intention was to create an interior that felt much more dynamic, while naturally directing the attention of visitors towards the high altar. The interiors were also deliberately designed to be bright. Light was often introduced through hidden openings, such as dome lanterns or concealed areas behind cornices. As a result, the light appeared to come directly from heaven, placing particular emphasis on the altar and important statues of saints. Because of this, light became much more than a practical necessity. It became an architectural tool that also carried a religious message. Rich decoration played an equally important role. Marble columns, gilded altars, elaborately carved pulpits, decorative stucco, and monumental ceiling paintings were all intended to inspire while demonstrating the glory and power of God. Illusionistic ceiling paintings in particular made the church appear open towards the sky, creating the impression of an endless heavenly space. For this reason, Baroque churches were not simply places for worship. They were deliberately designed as emotional spaces in which architecture, sculpture, painting, and light emerged into one complete work of art that was meant to impress visitors and strengthen their faith. One of the best examples for just how far these experiments with floor plans could go is San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane in Rome by Francesco Borromini. Its completely curved facade gives the impression that the walls themselves are moving, making the entire building appear almost alive. To create the energy, scale, and emotional impact that became characteristic of the Baroque, architects relied on a wide range of architectural and decorative elements. Unlike the Renaissance, which focused on balance, clear proportions, and calm forms, the Baroque was designed to surprise and overwhelm its audience. Facades became deeper and more three-dimensional, interiors larger and brighter, while decoration became significantly richer. These elements were not used simply for decoration. They also served to demonstrate power, wealth, and religious authority. Churches and royal residences especially were intended to leave no doubt about the influence of the people who commissioned them. By combining architecture, sculpture, painting, and carefully planned lighting, architects created a unified composition that appealed directly to the emotions of every visitor. Among the most important structural elements were the large domes. Both visually and symbolically, they represented the connection between the earthly world and heaven. At the same time, they made buildings visible from a great distance and often dominated the skyline of entire cities. To connect the different heights of a building smoothly, for example between the high central nave and the lower side aisle of a church, architects frequently used volutes. These scroll-shaped ornaments created a smooth transition between the different roof levels. Columns and pilasters were also widely used to add depth to facades while emphasizing the vertical height of the building. Another common feature was the broken pediment. Instead of closing the traditional triangular or curved pediment above the windows and entrances, the center was deliberately left open to provide space for statues, decorative vases, or family coats of arms. This gave the facades a much more lively appearance while breaking away from the rigid forms of earlier architectural styles. On the decorative side, concave and convex curves became one of the defining characteristics of Baroque architecture. Walls alternated between curving inwards and outwards, removing the rigid appearance of earlier buildings and creating the impression of continuous movement. This made facades appear much more dynamic and three-dimensional. The monumental appearance of many Baroque buildings was further strengthened through the use of the colossal order, where columns or pilasters extended across several stories without interruption. This made the facades appear taller, more imposing, and more monumental. These features were complemented by decorative cornices, balustrades, sculptures, and elaborate stucco ornaments, all of which added further depth to the facades. Finally, the illusionistic world of the Baroque reached its peak through trompe-l'œil painting. Flat ceilings were painted using perspective so convincingly that they appeared to open into an endless heavenly space filled with angels. These illusionistic paintings visually enlarged the interior while creating the impression that the boundary between architecture and heaven had finally disappeared completely. Following the destruction caused by the 30 Years' War, an enormous building boom began throughout the Holy Roman Empire during the second half of the 17th century. Both the regional rulers and the church sought to restore their authority by constructing impressive new buildings. However, the Baroque soon developed differently depending on religion and region. In the Catholic South, particularly in Austria, Bohemia, Bavaria, and Franconia, architecture followed the richly decorated and highly three-dimensional High Baroque of Italy. Grand buildings such as the Schloss Schönbrunn in Vienna or the St. Nicholas Church in Prague became some of its finest examples. In contrast, the Protestant regions favored a much more restrained architectural language that relied on classical forms and local traditions. The spread of the Baroque was also supported by traveling architects, sculptors, and stucco workers from Italy, working at many of the royal courts throughout the empire. They introduced the new architectural ideas while adapting them to local building traditions. As a result, many regional variations of the Baroque developed across Central Europe. In central Germany, a particularly distinctive form of the Baroque emerged during the reign of Augustus dem Starken, the Dresden Baroque. Thanks to the excellent quality of Saxon sandstone, building of this style achieved an almost sculptural appearance while maintaining a remarkable sense of lightness. At the same time, their playful decoration already hinted at the transition towards the Rococo. One of the finest examples of Protestant Baroque architecture is the Dresden Frauenkirche by George Beer. Designed as a central planned church, it departed from the traditional Catholic layout by arranging the entire interior around the pulpit. Its famous sandstone dome, commonly known as the stone bell or Steinglocke, is still regarded as one of the greatest engineering achievements of its time. The Dresden Swinger by Matthäus Daniel Pöppelmann represents the masterpiece of secular festive architecture. Originally designed as an orangerie and royal festival complex, it perfectly combines architecture and sculpture. The solid walls dissolve into open galleries, elegant pavilions, and extensive sculptural decoration, creating one unified composition. Augustus the Strong deliberately used architecture as a political instrument. Through projects such as the Swinger, he intended to place Dresden along the great royal capitals of Europe, including Paris and Vienna, while emphasizing Saxony's importance as a major European power. Further west, regional variations also developed in Thuringia and Hesse, while Friedenstein Palace in Gotha represents an early and comparatively austere form of the Baroque. Fulda Cathedral by Johann Dietzenhofer forms a stylistic bridge towards the rich and highly three-dimensional Baroque of Franconia. In Protestant northern Germany, the Baroque developed in much more restrained and rational direction than in the Catholic south. Strongly influenced by Dutch Baroque classicism, architects avoided extensive gilding, imitation marble, and dramatically curved facades, considering them unnecessary distractions. Instead, they relied on clear geometrical forms and the region's traditional building material, red brick. The main church of St. Michaelis in Hamburg is better known as the Michel, is one of the best examples of this northern approach. From the outside, it appears as a monumental yet straightforward brick building whose design remains remarkably restrained despite its Baroque dimensions. Only inside does the characteristic Baroque sense of space become fully visible. Bright white and gold colors maximize the natural daylight while directing all attention towards the central pulpit and altar in accordance with Protestant beliefs. Further to the northeast, particularly in Prussia under Andreas Schlüter, another variation of the Baroque emerged. Buildings such as the Berliner Zeughaus, the reconstructed Berlin Palace, and the Charlottenburg Palace combine powerful facades with deep sculptural decorations while maintaining the northern preference for order and symmetry. This more restrained architectural language reflected the Protestant understanding of church services. Since the sermon and the Word of God remained the central focus, architecture aimed less at overwhelming the senses and instead emphasized clarity, brightness, and excellent acoustics. In general, Baroque architecture was far more than simply a new architectural style. It became an expression of power, faith, and social status by combining architecture, sculpture, painting, and garden design into one unified work of art. While the Catholic regions of Europe favored monumental and highly dynamic forms, the Protestant North developed noticeably more restrained interpretations of the same style. Despite these regional differences, the overall goal remained unchanged: to impress the viewer, evoke strong emotions, and visibly demonstrate the authority of both the church and the ruler. fantastically represent all those changes to architecture within the city of Werderburg, we got 4 major building hotspots in today's episode. Let's start with the first one. The second oldest church in Werderburg, also one of the only 2 of Werderburg's main churches on the original medieval city island, was demolished and rebuilt. That was, to be honest, not only a decision in the name of storytelling, but also something, as some of you already noticed, and that annoyed me more or less since I built this church in the first place. It was facing the wrong direction. Since the early Middle Ages, most churches' altars faced west. I somehow managed to let all church altars face more or less the same direction, well, apart from that single church. It felt off, so I finally had a valid argument to demolish it and completely rebuild the new area. Now you might ask, but why are those 2 massive churches so nearby? Well, it's actually because of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation itself. In the years after the 30 Years' War, as already stated, the Catholic Church, especially the Jesuit order, built many new churches throughout the empire. Now, Werderburg, however, is a bit of a mixture. Even though most of the inhabitants and the ruler are Protestant, there still are old possessions of Catholic bishoprics in the city, namely the second oldest church in the city, the St. Laurentius Church. In context of the Counter-Reformation, the bishopric, under the influence of the Habsburg emperors, decided to build a new Baroque church in the area of the old St. Laurentius. Around the new church, the marketplace got firmly extended, and is now paved with cobblestone as the first one in the history of the city. This circumstance creates a very interesting plaza that contains not just 1 but 2 major churches of the city and the Renaissance Town Hall. The second project in the city is not a single project, but many smaller ones combined. Along the 2 new churches of the city, many new residential Baroque houses were built. Those were mainly influenced in the city not only by the new Baroque church already mentioned, but also by the new palace that will be built in an upcoming episode. Those new Baroque buildings represent especially the wealth of the bourgeoisie or the burghers. To name the third of the 4 main projects, we have to take a look at the harbour extensions yet again. Werderburg had always in the history of the city an underrepresented harbour. That is something I must change now. Therefore, as you might have noticed last episode already, the harbour was expanded and is now extended yet again. I also added a few small backyards and small alleyways to create a really packed scenery for the ever-growing city of Werderburg. Actually, talking about the growth of the city, as you can't really know the city's real population count by City Skylines itself, I did some research, and after looking at the different household counts of the houses situated within the city of Werderburg, I came to a conclusion that the actual household count is about 30 to 40% higher than the one shown in City Skylines. Taking the new value of household, multiplying this by the average population living in one household at the time, being about 4 to 6 people, I calculated the actual, hopefully realistic population count of the city, sitting around 30,000 inhabitants, making Werderburg one of the largest cities in Germany at the time, comparable to modern cities at the time, for example Bremen or Munich. But now let's talk about the biggest project of them all, the second church and the beginning of the so-called Neustadt in Werderburg. In most German cities, you can find this separation within the old town between the old town core, the Altstadt, and the early modern inner city, the so-called Neustadt, which was in most cities, as in Werderburg, started with the expansion of the city walls to proper bastion city system defenses. In the heart of the new Neustadt, we got a massive church. For this church, I used the St. Katharinenkirche from my hometown of Hamburg. It especially fits the building style of the Northern Baroque, containing a Gothic rib and nave, but also a classical Baroque tower, being characterized by especially the kind of twirl it has, moving from an square-shaped basis to an octagon-shaped beginning of the actual high-rise tower, before then going over into an Baroque characteristic, the onion dome on top.